When my daughter told me to find somewhere else to die, she handed me 2 suitcases and 20 crumpled dollar bills and closed the door as if she were shutting out a draft. That's how it started, not with shouting, not with the kind of cinematic betrayal you see in movies, but with a small domestic cruelty dressed up as practicality. "We can't keep living like this, Mom," Victoria said. "You need to go. Find somewhere else to die." Then she slid a thin envelope across the hallway table, and it fell open, showing a single refund check for $200 and the rest of her impatience. I've always been good at folding linens, at making a home look like a small act of worship. I folded that insult into my sleeve and walked out with the 2 suitcases I'd owned since before we married, a shoebox of photographs, and the little blue recipe book Robert had given me on our 15th anniversary. The house behind me was quiet in the way big things are when they begin to be taken apart. The mantel empty where family pictures had lived for decades, the back porch chair that had imprinted his shape into the cushion. I tied the knot on my suitcase like a neat little promise to myself. There are worse things than leaving, and I believed, briefly, that grief would be enough to cushion whatever came next. It wasn't. The motel clerk took my $200 and handed me a thin card key without looking me in the eye. He said nothing about the 2 suitcases or the shoebox. He said, "Room 7. The curtains in Room 7 had seen better lives, a pattern of sun-faded flowers, and a television that worked when it liked. I set the shoebox on the bed and opened it carefully, as if pulling out another secret might be dangerous to my hands. There were pictures of Robert and me at the county fair, our faces young and sunburned, and a folded program from the church concert where he'd been too embarrassed to clap. In the top of the box, his old pocket watch, worn and stopped at 2:07, looked like an accusation. I slept for 2 hours and then woke with the kind of bolt of alertness you only get when a muscle has been used for decades and then forgotten. I realized I had enough anger left in me to do something smart, not loud, not dramatic, smart. Before I came to this mess, I'd been married to Robert for 43 years. 43 years of folding shirts, of listening to his long phone calls with men I thought were merely business associates, of learning to make his coffee just so. I'd been a partner and then a caretaker. In the last few years, his memory slid away in little polite increments, and I learned to read the times on his face as if they were street signs. Victoria had always been the favorite child, no use hiding it. He took to her quicker and easier than he did to me when he first met her, the way some savvy men take to particular luxuries. He'd say things like, "Vicky understands," and I would smile and move on. After the funeral, the distance widened into intention. It wasn't that she had begun with malice. It was that, finally, she had no patience left for the small, messy business of caring for someone else. I heard that patience turn into calculation in the weeks after Robert died. There were calls I answered that she intercepted. There were brochures for downsizing that arrived in the mail with a tidy, neutral voice. She started bringing a man around, Kevin Hayes, who laughed loud and made light of money as if it were a game you could always win. He was an investment banker, she said. He was practical. He was efficient. The house went from being mine to being a ledger in her eyes. When she told me to leave, she did it like someone doing me a favor. She'd tried other, quieter ways before, the gentle hints about simplifying, the offers to help me find a condo near the city. Those were tests that I failed because I expected the person who birthed me to be capable of tenderness. This was not tenderness. This was the sound of a woman who had convinced herself she had a right to the ledger line that bore our lives. The first night at the motel, I called Harrison Fitzgerald. Harrison had been our lawyer for 20 years, soft-spoken, square-shouldered, always smelling faintly of old books. He was the kind of man who believed in the sanctity of a signature more than in the sanctity of a handshake. I had called him on matters small and large, Wills, small claims, a nasty neighbor dispute about hedges. I called him from the payphone in the motel lobby because I did not yet trust Victoria to be absent of malice. "Harrison," I said, and I do not remember explaining who I was. He would have known before I'd filled half the sentence. He was there in 10 minutes, enormous in a gray overcoat, eyes like someone who kept a private ledger of his own disappointments. He came in with a leather briefcase and sat me down on the bed like we were in a less modern version of a courtroom. He listened first, letting silence do the heavy lifting. When I told him how Victoria had said it, he did not flinch. He kept his hands folded on his knees and said, "Have you seen the will?" "No," I said. "I was told there are copies in the safe." He paused. "The original safe at the trust, but there's something you should know. After Robert's heart attack last summer, he asked me to make some edits. We updated the trust, and he signed a new codicil." A codicil is a small amendment to a will. I'd heard the word at church when the organist discussed estate planning in the vestibule, but it sounded like a private thing, like a whisper you'd want only the person you trusted to hear. Harrison reached into his briefcase and produced a slim envelope with my name on it. He said, "I wasn't going to do this over a motel bed, Margaret, but time is a thing that moves you." He slid out a single, cream-colored paper and read aloud. The voice he used for legal documents was different from the voice he used in conversation. Bookish, slow, careful. Article 20 teen, he read. "To my spouse, Margaret James Sullivan, 70% of the residuary estate, the family home at 14 Morton Lane, and a lifetime trust to be administered for her health, comfort, and maintenance." My throat closed like a curtain. For a long second, I heard only the hum of the motel air conditioner and the distant, muffled laughter of someone else's television. 70%? I whispered. 70%. Harrison tapped the paper. "And listen to this." He cleared his throat. I felt the words like small stones. Article 21. To my daughter, Victoria Hayes, a trust in the amount of $10 million to be held in trust for her sole benefit, conditioned upon her conduct toward my spouse. Should the trustee determine, by clear and convincing evidence, that the beneficiary has engaged in physical, emotional, or financial mistreatment of my spouse, the trustee shall withhold, suspend, or redirect the trust funds pursuant to the terms set out herein, and the residuary shall revert as though she had predeceased me. He looked at me then in a way that made me feel the years settle into a different kind of gravity. "He put a clause, Margaret," Harrison said, "a standard of care clause. He was explicit. He wanted to protect you from being taken advantage of." My first impulse was relief so sudden I braced for a tide. The second impulse was something else entirely: ice. I thought of the thin envelope Victoria had given me, the $200, and that particular kind of discharge. I thought of the way Kevin liked to stand in the doorway and offer his solutions as if life were a project management meeting. "Where does it say anything about dignity?" I asked. "It doesn't use the word dignity," Harrison said. "It uses conduct." But he enumerated categories: emotional neglect, financial exploitation, forced eviction without just cause. He paused, the way someone holds a camera steady before they take a photograph. If Mrs. Hayes or Mr. Hayes, their names are in the codicil, engage in such behavior, the trustee has discretion to deny the $10 million trust and to allow the residuary to flow to you. Under the numbers Robert put down, that would make you the beneficiary of $33 million in total assets, or roughly that amount based on current valuations. There it was, $33 million. The number sounded obscene in a motel room, against the backdrop of floral curtains and a television with a mute button that did not work. I slid my hand over the old pocket watch and felt the dent where it had been in Robert's pocket. He had been precise with his money. He had been precise with his anger and his affection, too, but in the way of men who think they can measure love with a spreadsheet. The will was a measure of his last action. "Did he tell you why?" I asked. "Why the clause?" Harrison set the paper down and sat back. "He was worried," he said simply. "He wanted to make sure you weren't robbed of what you deserved. After that heart attack, he changed his priorities. He wanted protection in writing." The next hours moved with a speed I would later call surreal. Harrison drove me back to the house in his old sedan while I stared out at the thinning trees that marked the end of our block. At the house, I walked through rooms that were crowded and empty at once. The movers from the funeral had taken the easy things, the television, the big chair. The things that mattered remained, the china, his briefcase, the embroidered quilt on the bed. I called Detective Rodriguez from the front porch because Harrison suggested we notify the police about the eviction and the suspicious documents Victoria had left with the property manager. Rodriguez told me to come down to the station. He wanted to get my statement while memories were fresh. Detective Rodriguez is good at the parts of his job that are not showy. He has a flat tone and hands that habitually find his belt, like someone waiting to anchor himself to something. He listened to my account, the envelope, the check, the way Victoria had arranged things to look like a gentle nudge toward a new life. I told him about the sealed safe and how Victoria had been seen by the bank manager asking about access to the estate accounts. "Do you suspect forgery?" he asked. I did, but suspicion, as I learned that night, is a legal thing. It must be shaped into probable cause, and probable cause needs evidence. Harrison had already ordered a handwriting analysis and sent copies of the codicil to a forensic accountant he trusted. That same accountant, a woman named Carol Chen, whose name would become significant to me in the days that followed, came the next morning with questions that felt like tiny chisels working away at the stone of what Victoria and Kevin had thought was a perfect plan. Carol was not a woman who marched into rooms with a flourish. She came with spreadsheets, loose hair tied in a practical knot, and a temper that had been honed by looking at ledgers until the numbers stopped being numbers and became stories. The word laundering arrived like a cold draft. I had heard it in documentaries and in passing at dinner parties. It had the faint glamour of something dangerous. Carol did not dramatize things. "I don't have charges," she said. "I have irregularities. But if these transfers are what they look like, we have a problem that requires authorities." Harrison made a call. He called the bank and asked them to freeze accounts pending verification. He called his contacts at the probate court. He called a handwriting analyst who confirmed that the paper, unsigned in Victoria's handwriting, was not Robert's, and that the codicil Harrison had in his safe was the one the court would accept. He also called me something gentle, something that sounded like a reminder that I had agency. "We will not let them steamroll you," he said, "not if I can help it." Victoria, in the days between that motel bed and the first freeze, behaved as if nothing had shifted beneath her feet. She came at me with texts that alternated between faux concern and thin threats. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," one message read. "For both our sakes, move out. I'll help you settle somewhere nice." Another text showed a photo of a condo with glass railings and a view over the river. A third was curt and businesslike. "The trustee has the documents. We'll be handling affairs. Please cooperate." There is a kind of violence in the banality of those messages. They are small, administrative acts of cruelty. They do what cruelty always does. They make you doubt your right to exist in the place you've stitched together for decades. Within 24 hours of Harrison's call, the bank's compliance unit had placed holds on several accounts. The house title was flagged for review. There was an email from the probate clerk asking for a certified copy of the codicil. It felt, briefly, like movement in my favor, an institutional muscle making itself useful. But it also felt like the beginning of a very public examination of our private life. Kevin Hayes, for his part, had a look of someone who had been taught to smooth over other people's discomfort for a living. He arrived at the house with Eleanor Hayes, his mother, a woman who kept her coiffure immaculate and her expression softer than her son's. Eleanor was all apologies and forced warmth, the sort of mother-in-law who had been trained by polite society to dissemble real feelings into platitudes. They staged their concern in the foyer as if they were auditioning for a part in a play. Kevin's phone never stopped buzzing. He answered with the practiced patience of someone who lives and deals. He told me, on the porch, that Harrison was overreacting. "We can settle this quickly," he said. "It's messy, sure, but money makes things tidy. Why drag this through the court? Why make your daughter suffer in public?" "Your daughter kicked me out," I said. The words were small and hard. "She didn't mean," Kevin began. "She handed me $200 and a check and told me to find somewhere else to die," I said again, because it felt important to say it aloud, as if the sound would make the cruelty less likely to be forgotten. That night, Victoria called. Her voice on the line was different from the texts, less clipped, frayed at the edges. "Mom, we can work something out," she said. "We want to keep things in the family. Why escalate? If you just move to the condo, we'll set you up. You'll be comfortable." "What changed?" I asked. "Why the hurry before the trust is even read?" There was a pause, long enough for the room's dust motes to perform a slow ballet in the lamplight. "Robert would want things handled," she said finally. "You know that. People aren't built for complications." "Robert made a clause to protect me," I said. "Didn't he tell you?" That pause again. "People change when someone dies," she said. "We need to manage expectations. I don't want to fight you." I could hear Kevin in the background giving orders about logistics and whether I could move on the second or third day. The temptation to believe her words was real. They had the tones of reconciliation polished into something pragmatic. But Harrison had already sent a text. The handwriting analyst wanted more samples. Carol had found a trail that looked engineered, and Detective Rodriguez had asked for all communications between Victoria and the bank. This was not going to stay private. The day the accounts were frozen is one I remember for the silence after the action. The phone calls came in a steady stream. The bank manager, Harrison, Carol, and then Detective Rodriguez. "We'll need you to come downtown," Rodriguez said. "We're going to take your statement, and we're opening an inquiry." An inquiry is a funny thing, because it is not a promise. It's the possibility of something else. It is the hinge on which the rest of the house might swing. Victoria's reaction in those hours was theatrical in its minimalism. She posted a short message on social media, words of concern about family stress and protecting privacy. She sent me a link to a petition for elder-friendly housing improvements at the city council, as if rhetorical concern could substitute for action. When I asked her, plainly over the phone, whether she had signed any documents to remove me as a beneficiary, she snapped, "You're imagining things, Mom. Don't weaponize grief." It is a strange feeling to be the one people call with details about your own life, as if the facts are a commodity you do not deserve to possess. And yet the facts were lining up. Harrison walked me through them like an archivist cataloging a body of work. The altered beneficiary forms bore the same hand, according to Carol's initial examination. ACH transfers had moved funds into accounts that were inconsistent with our family's history, accounts with names that belonged to companies that manufactured nothing. The day the accounts were frozen is one I remember for the silence after the action. The phone calls came in a steady stream. The bank manager, Harrison, Carol, and then Detective Rodriguez. "We'll need you to come downtown," Rodriguez said. "We're going to take your statement and we're opening an inquiry." An inquiry is a funny thing because it is not a promise. It's the possibility of something else. It is the hinge on which the rest of the house might swing. Victoria's reaction in those hours was theatrical in its minimalism. She posted a short message on social media, words of concern about family stress and protecting privacy. She sent me a link to a petition for elder-friendly housing improvements at the city council, as if rhetorical concern could substitute for action. When I asked her, plainly over the phone, whether she had signed any documents to remove me as a beneficiary, she snapped, "You're imagining things, Mom. Don't weaponize grief." It is a strange feeling to be the one people call with details about your own life, as if the facts are a commodity you do not deserve to possess. And yet the facts were lining up. Harrison walked me through them like an archivist cataloging a body of work. The altered beneficiary forms bore the same hand, according to Carol's initial examination. ACH transfers had moved funds into accounts that were inconsistent with our family's history, accounts with names that belonged to companies that manufactured nothing. Carol had already gone to work, calling in favors, making a map of where the money had walked in the night. That evening, in the kitchen of what had once been my home, now quiet and under the haze of caution tape, no, not tape, but the quiet that follows a house falling under the scrutiny of law, Carol laid her laptop on the dining table and opened a document. The screen lit our faces like a small altar. "I want you to look at this," she said. "Follow my finger here." She began to name the companies and the times of transfers, and to my untrained eye, the list looked like a foreign language, names and times and numbers. But she had a way of telling the story when she translated it into the small betrayals I could understand. A transfer at midnight when the family had been asleep, a wire routed through 3 banks in 2 countries, a beneficiary change backdated to a day when Robert was in the hospital. "It's organized," she said. "It's not sloppy. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." I felt a strange combination of humiliation and clarity. To be deceived is one of the loneliest forms of grief. You mourn both the person you loved and the version of that person you thought you knew. And yet, as the pattern appeared in black and white on Carol's laptop, something else arrived with it, a way forward. That night, Victoria arrived at the house with a lawyer I'd never seen before, a man who wore his suit like armor. He brought a tablet and a package of papers. "Let's try to be reasonable," he said. "My clients want an amicable solution." "What solution?" I asked. "You're the ones who moved me out." "We can compensate you," he said. "We don't want this in court." Kevin hovered behind him with the kind of smile that practiced sympathy in mirrors. Eleanor clutched her purse and murmured something about family turmoil and how difficult it all must be. Harrison took the papers and read with the patience of a man who knows how to adjust to the beat of other people's surprises. He did not look up when he said, "These are offers." He named a figure that was both generous and offensive in equal measures, a payout tax-free to avoid public litigation. "This," he said softly, "is an attempt to pay for silence." Victoria watched me with the look of someone who believed the ledger would always be her friend. "We don't want to make this painful for you," she said. She leaned in as if offering comfort. "Just take the offer. It's practical." I thought of the $200 in my pocket and the 4 dozen small decisions that had led us to this. I thought of the quilt, of his watch stopped at 2:07. Some part of me, tempered by years of folding linens and living inside compromises, wanted to say yes, to accept the practical life and find a small condo with sunlight on the floor. Another part, strangely young and fierce, remembered the way he had looked at me at 50 when he still wanted to linger at the boardwalk. He had written protections into papers because he knew the landscape of small cruelties. I looked at Victoria and felt the heat of a future being hoarded. "No," I said. The word landed in the room like a soft hammer. I expected flailing, tears, hysteria. Instead, there was a cold arithmetic look, then a softer pleading as if she were stunned. "You are making a mistake," she said. "We will move forward with the probate process," Harrison said. "The trustee will make a determination. The bank has been advised to freeze the funds pending verification. If there are forgeries, they will be investigated. You don't have proof, Victoria said. This is all accusations. Detective Rodriguez arrived with a neat stack of forms and an even neater sense of the work ahead. He asked for copies of every communication and every bank statement Harrison had found. He took my statement with the sort of gravitas that comes from someone who has seen similar scripts play out. He did not promise me justice. He promised me this, that they would investigate and that the investigation would follow wherever the evidence led. For someone who had been so often invisible, being the center of an inquiry felt like stepping too close to a damage lamp. The light shows what's there: dust motes, cracks, things you can't fix with polish. Then, a complication. The forensic accountant traced a strand of transfers to an entity that did not belong to our family at all. It belonged to a set of businesses that handled international transfers in a way that screamed laundering. Funds moved to a shell, then to another shell, then to a brokerage. Carol sat back, and I could see the calculation working behind her eyes. "This is not a simple family dispute," she said. "This touches on federal territory." When she said federal, it felt like the room tilted. Federal means different hands, different rules, different power. Carol began to speak faster then, telling us of suspicious accounts that had names connected to industries Robert had never touched, to invoices that paid for nothing. Harrison's face closed into a kind of professional whirly. Detective Rodriguez, for his part, called the county DA and recommended that we share our findings with federal authorities. "If there is out-of-state wiring and shell companies," he said, "we need to bring it to the attention of the right people." There is a small, private terror that comes with complexity. It feels like falling through a floor you did not know existed. For me, it felt like the house I'd loved had been a necessary hideout for secrets that had multiplied behind the wallpaper. I slept little that night for the first time in years, a vigil at the edge of what might be a new life. By the third day at the motel, Victoria's messages had changed in tone. They had gone from clipped and transactional to jittery and pleading, a tonal shift like the weather breaking. One text read, "Mom, please, we are worried about you. This has gotten out of control. Let's talk, please." There is an audacity to that kind of request, the person who had just ordered you out now asking you to console them. I let the message sit. I read it 3 times. It was designed to pry. Harrison and I met in his office that afternoon. Carol had compiled a preliminary report, and Detective Rodriguez had filed an initial incident report. Harrison placed everything in chronological order: the codicil, the altered beneficiary forms, the ACH transfers, the bank holds. He was careful in his phrasing, like a surgeon setting a limb into place. "We have enough here," he said. "To proceed, we need to make sure we involve the proper agencies. This cuts into potential federal concerns." "Are they going to arrest them?" I asked. The question was clumsy because I wanted the quick solace of epilogue. "No," Harrison said. "Investigation first. We need warrants, subpoenas. We need to protect you against possible retaliation. There are a number of parallel steps we can take. One is to secure your immediate safety and your access to essentials. Another is to begin civil motions for an emergency injunction to prevent the sale or transfer of any assets until the court can weigh in. And then there's the criminal track, which requires the DA or federal prosecutors, depending on the scope." He paused and folded his hands, a small clerical gesture. "We will need to consider contacting federal agents," he said. "If those shells cross borders, we have to bring in people who have that jurisdiction. I can help facilitate an introduction, but I must warn you, Margaret, once they are involved, the case becomes larger than any of us imagined." That word, larger, sat heavily between us. I thought of the quilt and my habit of keeping the house smelling like lemon and linen. I thought of the way Robert had kept a little notebook tucked behind a false bottom in his desk. I thought of the nights I had sat awake listening to his breathing, never imagining that his life might be a ledger of things I did not know how to read. At the end of the meeting, Harrison folded his hands again and said, "Make no rash decisions. Let me coordinate with Detective Rodriguez and Carol. We will take protective steps for you." Then he stood and handed me an envelope. Inside, a single card with a phone number scribbled on the back. "If you feel threatened, call this number," he said. The card felt like a talisman. That night, back in room 7, I placed it on top of the recipe book Robert had given me years before. I tried to read a page about lemon cake, his favorite, but my appetite was gone. The motel room smelt faintly of bleach and old coffee, and the television whispered other people's small dramas into the dark. At 2 in the morning, my phone vibrated. It was Victoria. Her voice was a thin thread. "Mom," she said, "please, I didn't mean." "You meant to move me," I said. "You meant to make this a ledger entry." There was a hitch in her breathing that sounded almost like sobbing. "We panicked," she said. "We didn't know what to do. Kevin said it could be sorted. We thought you had the right," I finished. "You thought you had the right." "Please," she said again, more desperate now. "Please, I'm begging you. Don't make this worse." I held the phone as if it were a small animal. Her begging did not erase the fact that someone had tried to change a signature, had moved money in the night, had set up companies that existed only on paper. It did not erase the shove of the door or the $200 in my pocket. But begging sounded smaller now, thin against the architecture of what she had done. "Talk to Harrison," I said. "Talk to Detective Rodriguez. Cooperate. Let the law sort this out." She sighed like someone half relieved and half terrified. "We'll cooperate," she said. "We'll do what we have to." I did not yet know if that was a promise or a ploy. There is an economy to deception. You spend a little to get a lot, and I had been banked against that economy for decades. I pressed the phone to my ear and listened to her breathe until she hung up. The days after that were a blur of paper and caution. We closed the house to visitors, not with a barricade, but with the careful permission slips of a judge's order. The bank freezes held. Harrison filed the paperwork to secure the property and to put an emergency trustee in place to review the terms of the trust. Carol kept digging. Detective Rodriguez coordinated interviews. Kevin's and Victoria's names appeared in the edges of subpoenas as people to be interviewed. As the inquiry extended, small neighbors came by with casseroles and stunned apologies. People I had once laughed with in the church parking lot came and said things about family and sorrow. I thanked them because you must not be rude about casseroles, though every one of them felt like a small, soft attempt to patch what had been ripped. There is a peculiar clarity that comes with being watched by institutions. Your life is parsed in forms and footnotes. You begin to understand your days as a ledger of entry and exit. I learned to take inventory, the pocket watch that had stopped at 2:07, the recipe book, the box of photographs. I learned to inventory my own choices. And I began to make plans that were not dependent on anyone else's goodwill. I learned to say no without the old trembling apology. I learned to step into rooms where papers were read aloud and to place my hand on the things I remembered. I learned that indignity can be a kind of armor if you choose it. When Carol came to my motel room one evening with a folder and a look that said she had been sorting through contradictions all day, she laid the folder on my lap and opened it slowly. "This is more than just bad actors in the family," she said. "There are patterns here that suggest an institutional approach. Look at these bank names, these transfer routes. People have been using the family's accounts as a hub." "Why would they use us?" I asked. "Why our accounts?" "Because they were available," she said. Because when someone dies, there's a period where accounts are vulnerable, especially when there's a vulnerable spouse. And because your husband handled money in a way that put things in places we're now trying to map, there may be third parties. The words third parties made me think of people I had never known my husband to be. I thought of meetings I had not been invited to. I thought of the rustle of men in suits at the country club. There was a small, mounting dread that the house of my life had been an intersection of many kinds of transactions. I called Robert's sister that night. She did not know the names Carol mentioned. She wept when I told her about the transfers. "Bob would never have let anyone take you," she said. "He loved you." "He loved me enough to write a codicil," I corrected, with a laugh that tasted like metal. The codicil was his final act of care. He made a measure to protect me, a little injunction of his own love against the greed that sometimes blooms in relatives' hearts. I clung to that clause like a buoy. Word travels, even in small towns, and by the fourth day at the motel, the roof of my life began to leak with attention. Reporters called, which Harrison curbed with a polite legalese that blamed the privacy of probate. The television vans appeared 2 streets over and left confused when they found the house closed under the careful hush of legal process. Victoria, who had thought squeaky clean frames would protect her, found that the squeak had an audience. She called again on that 4th night. This time her voice was split with something savage and tender both. "Please," she whispered, "we can put this back. We have offers. We can fix this without dragging us into federal complications. Do you hear me, Mom? It will cost less. If you take the money, we can all move on." It is difficult to describe the precise flavor of disappointment. It is not only betrayal, but the realization that the person you raised was willing to barter your dignity for the smooth functioning of their life. I did not say what I felt because I had no time for performative cruelty. I said instead what Robert would have wanted. "We will let the law decide," I said, "and we will make sure the trustees do their job." There was silence on the line for a moment, and then Victoria said in a small, sharp voice, "You don't understand what this will do to our family." "It will do what you made it do," I said, "and I will not be made small to cover it." "You don't understand what this will do to our family," Victoria said, small and sharp, as if the word family were a fragile ornament she feared might crack. "It will do what you made it do," I said, "and I will not be made small to cover it." If you want to hear how this ends, subscribe. And if you've experienced family injustice, type "not alone" in the comments. She hung up without another word. After that call, things moved faster, not because anyone chose speed for drama's sake, but because institutions begin to move when you hand them a thread they can pull. Harrison filed an emergency petition to appoint a neutral trustee to oversee the $10 million trust and to maintain the residuary assets while the probate clerk certified the codicil. The judge signed a temporary restraining order that prevented any transfers from the flagged accounts. The bank's compliance unit kept the holds in place. Carol spent that afternoon on the phone with overseas banks, tracing a path of wires that looked like a badly drawn river, messy, deliberate, and flowing to neither shore nor destination. Detective Rodriguez kept his promises with the kind of calm that sounds like competence. He interviewed Victoria and Kevin separately, not to score a point, but to build the kind of timeline that could hold up under subpoenas. Kevin's alibi was punctual and polished: spreadsheets, server logs, an invoice from a consulting firm. Victoria's answers shifted like shadows when you moved the light. At one point, she said she had only asked the bank for advice. At another, she denied ever having asked. Detective Rodriguez marked each contradiction without drama. "We document," he would say. "We don't editorialize." It was Carol who found the small misstep that would bend the arc toward federal involvement. She was in the county records building when she found an invoice buried in a ledger that should held nothing but utility bills, showing a wire that ended up in a brokerage account under a name that matched a known laundering front in a neighboring state. The name was innocuous enough by itself, but the pattern of transfers made the account look like a sorting room for stolen things. She called me from a coffee shop with the background noise of clattering cups sounding like a courtroom in miniature. "They routed it through 3 different institutions, Margaret," she said. "It's not just family gremlins here. We should let federal investigators see this." Harrison agreed and made the call. He arranged a meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office and a field agent from the FBI who introduced herself as Special Agent Sarah Martinez. She arrived in a dark suit that spoke of practicality and a face that had learned to listen before she asked questions. Harrison and I met her in a quiet conference room that smelled faintly of lemon and institutional hope. "Miss Sullivan," she began without preamble, "we've received a referral from the county regarding potential wire fraud and possible money laundering involving interstate transfers. We'll need to review everything you and your team have found. We also have to talk about any potential danger you might be in." I told her, plainly, what had happened: the eviction, the forgeries, the transfers. I did not talk about the postcards Robert used to send me from business trips, the old jokes we kept between us, the way he once kissed my forehead when the moon was high and we had money enough for nothing spectacular. I told her the facts that mattered to her paperwork. Agent Martinez listened, and when she spoke, she did so in steady, legal sentences. "If the wires are what they seem, this will be a federal matter. We can open a criminal case parallel to your civil protections." She paused. "There is something else you should know, something that affects the asset questions. We have information that your late husband was cooperating with our office in an ongoing investigation. That cooperation can influence the disposition of certain funds. It can sometimes clear assets of illicit taint if there's a documented chain showing they were proceeds of investigations we were conducting. That's complicated, and it's not automatic, but it's why we're here." The word cooperation pulled a small, sharp breath from me. I thought of the little notebook Robert had kept in a false drawer, the way he would sometimes say cryptic things and smile as if sharing a private map. "He worked with you?" Agent Martinez did not answer that directly. "There are matters we cannot disclose fully in a public record, Miss Sullivan, but I can say this. If your husband provided information that helped dismantle certain operations, and if those funds are tied to ongoing federal actions, that could clarify some things about the chain of title we're looking at. It will require document review, and it will require cooperation from you and your counsel." Harrison nodded once, the kind of professional acknowledgement that looks like a pivot point. He had a quiet face that seldom betrayed surprise, but now something like tightness crossed it. "We'll cooperate," he said. "Miss Sullivan wants the truth." Sarah Martinez's next words were careful. "There will be risks in making this public. We sometimes need witnesses who help us gather evidence. There's protective work we can do, but protective work is not insurance. It buys time and security so the system can move. We'll advise you on what to say, who to meet, and how to document anything." The possibility of federal protection felt like a parachute. I realized then that my life, stable, small, folded neatly, sat over a map with highways I had never been told existed. Robert had kept roads secret from me, routes he took that had nothing to do with home. He had, apparently, been dancing on a wire I had not seen. To discover that he had been an informant was a betrayal of a different order, not of love necessarily, but of the bargain of intimacy. Still, if the consequence was to protect me from being reduced to a memory used as a ledger entry, I would take it. Agent Martinez and Harrison arranged the logistics with a kind of professional choreography. The FBI would open a preliminary probe. Detective Rodriguez would continue to handle local investigative steps and would coordinate with the agents to avoid jurisdictional confusion. Carol would keep tracing finances, providing the maps the feds needed. Harrison would manage the probate filings and civil motions to ensure the trustee had the authority to act. Everyone promised caution. They also promised action. That action arrived in the form of subpoenas and search warrants that read like the instruments of a story I had once thought belonged only in novels. Agents appeared at dawn at a shell corporation's registered address in another state and executed a seizure of documents. Servers were mirrored, emails were pulled and archived. The more they found, the more the picture grew less like a single bad decision and more like a pattern of habit and exploitation. I remember the day Agent Martinez asked me a question I had not expected. Would you be willing to participate in an interview or recorded conversation if it would help us obtain direct admissions from the people you suspect? My first instinct was to recoil. It sounded like something cinematic, an elderly woman seducing her own child into a trap. But Agent Martinez explained the safeguards. Any recorded contact would be overseen by counsel. Harrison would be present or on call. The recordings would be done with warrants and under the rules that make them admissible in court. If Victoria or Kevin made admissions on their own, uncoerced and captured lawfully, those admissions would be strong evidence. "You're asking me to risk embarrassing my daughter," I said, "and putting my family on a stage." "You are asking the system to do its work," she answered. "There are other options, but if you want us to build a strong criminal case, we need statements, and sometimes statements are made when people think they've closed the deal." I thought of the $200 and the way Victoria had slammed the door behind me. I thought of the nights I had made pies and the way she had always eaten just a sliver and asked about the interest rate on the family account, as if dessert were a metric. I thought, too, of the trustee clause Robert had written, protective and precise. I told Agent Martinez I would cooperate. The plan they devised was surgical. We would stage a meeting that looked like a negotiated settlement. Harrison, the FBI, and Detective Rodriguez would arrange it so that a neutral trustee representative would bring a check and a draft release to my former house, and I would be present to discuss the terms. The trustee would be represented by an attorney who would appear to be negotiating in good faith. What Victoria and Kevin would not know was that the trustee's representative was wearing a microphone connected to the agent's recording equipment. The room would also have legal observers and a surveillance team ready to act if any unlawful admissions were made or if any physical evidence of forgery or transfer was presented. I will not pretend I did not tremble. The plan required me to sit across from my daughter, to let her see my face, and to ask her to speak in the normal, practiced tones she had used when she wanted something. It required me to move past the immediate reflex to hide and to show up as a witness to my own life. Harrison put his hand on my shoulder in the parking lot like a benediction of sorts and said, "You do nothing that puts you at legal risk. You listen. If you feel unsafe at any point, we end things. Agent Martinez will be a step away." We set the meeting for a Friday afternoon when family rhythms might lull people into thinking the day would look ordinary. The trustee representative, an older woman named Marlene, who had been briefed on how to look convincing and to handle pressure, arrived with a folder and an envelope. It was arranged to look like a closing in the parlor, a sense of finality and the promise of cash over conflict. Victoria arrived with Kevin at her side. Eleanor watched from the doorway with a face like pressed flowers. They were careful in their movements, practiced in a way that made me think of a play rehearsed too many times. Victoria greeted me with a smile that had once been used to steady toddlers on staircases and to sell casserole dishes to neighbors. "Mom," she said, as if saying my old name could fold us back into the old story. We just want to put this behind us. I said nothing for a moment because silence can be a form of answer. Harrison introduced the trustee's representative and stated the purpose of the meeting: to negotiate a settlement that would avoid protracted litigation for the good of the family. Marlene slipped a check into the envelope, letting it be visible enough to let the thought of money do some of the work. And in exchange, Marlene said, we would ask for a standard release and a confidentiality agreement. Victoria's eyes glittered with that businesslike appetite I had learned to read as if it were another person's reflex. That sounds fair, she said, a clean break. Well, I said, I'm not sure I can release matters that are under investigation. Kevin's posture stiffened as if someone had misfiled an invoice in his ledger. You're making this into a show, he said. We're trying to protect everyone. Your protection has been in the form of eviction, I replied. Is that now the price of peace? Then the conversation turned the way the feds had hoped it would. Victoria asked what the bank wanted. Kevin leaned in and spoke in a voice meant to sound conciliatory, but that smelled of calculation. Look, he said, if you sign now, we can expedite. The trustee can front a portion. It will be cleaner, and you won't have to drag us through the papers. Marlene reached into her folder and produced a draft release. This language is very standard, she said, sliding the paper toward my daughter. Victoria picked up the paper, and I watched the muscle in her jaw work. Then she did something I did not expect. She offered an explanation for what had happened. Not an apology, but an attempt at rationalization. We panicked when your husband's accounts were in flux, she said. We were worried about our future. Kevin had advice from some acquaintances. We thought we could stabilize the portfolio. It was never meant to hurt you. She looked at me with a sorrow that seemed rehearsed. If you accept this, we can all move on. I don't want to make you relive this. That was when Kevin leaned back, and in what I later learned was a fatal mistake, he said too much. He described, under the happy camouflage of problem solving, the existence of an account that had been used as a temporary holding place. He used words like routing and parking as if the cash were nothing more than traffic management. He mentioned dates and amounts and a shell company registered under an alias that matched some of the names Carol had found. He used the phrase, we had to move it through a broker to hide it temporarily, in the way someone might describe hiding a surprise party's decorations. Marlene's pen stopped. Harrison's face tightened like a drawn curtain. Detective Rodriguez, who was nearby but not in the room, signaled to Agent Martinez. The people in the surveillance van were suddenly looking at multiple screens. The thing Kevin said out loud was admissible and had the weight of an admission. It also connected the dots Carol had been piecing together in spreadsheets and bank records. Victoria started to backtrack almost immediately. I didn't mean, she began. But the room was already ringing with recorded evidence. Marlene gently closed the file and said she would take the proposal to the trustee and that perhaps a mediated settlement was possible, but she would need time. Harrison suggested that, given the ongoing investigation, any settlement had to go through counsel and be reviewed by the appropriate authorities. Kevin looked as if somebody had flipped the table on him. He stammered about misstatements, about stress, about the wrong words at the wrong time. But what he had said on the record was on tape. The FBI teams outside were listening to a feed that would later be synchronized to the recorded accounts of ACH transfers and emails that Carol had found. You don't get to say things and take them back simply because you realized they were incriminating, Detective Rodriguez said quietly when the room had emptied enough to be dangerous. We document, we collect, and then we follow the legal process. A day later, warrants were issued for Kevin's devices and for a small office in town linked to his consulting work. The search turned up spreadsheets, draft beneficiary forms, and a thumb drive with copies of invoices that matched the shell companies Carol had traced. It was not cinematic, no bags of cash spilling from trunks, but it was meticulous and damning. Kevin was arrested that week on state charges related to fraud and forgery. The federal team indicated they were pursuing parallel inquiries for money laundering. Victoria called me once after Kevin's arrest and begged me to visit her at the small house she had rented while the legal dust settled. "Please, Mom," she said, voice ragged. "We didn't mean for this to get this big." "I know you didn't mean it," I answered, which was true to a degree. Many crimes begin with a lack of imagination about consequences rather than explicit malice. But it happened, Vicky. People were hurt. I was hurt. She cried then, a noise that could have been confession or calculation. "Help me," she said. "Please, Mom, I need you." Those words hit a place in me that was both old and tender. A mother's reflex is often to gather up the broken parts of her child and try to mend them. But there is a difference between mending and protecting. My job had changed. I was no longer the woman whose life could be folded into other people's convenience. I had been, in a bureaucratic sense, elevated by Robert's clause into a position that made me a steward. I had responsibilities now that extended beyond my private grief. I did what my lawyer and the agents advised. I did not promise her forgiveness. I urged cooperation. I offered practical help, a list of resources, counseling, legal aid, a program to help people adjust to the consequences of criminal allegations. I would not, however, be the person who smoothed her path by pretending the damage did not exist. At the federal level, the case deepened. Agent Martinez's team subpoenaed bank records, communications, and corporate registrations. They traced wires through a chain of shell entities into accounts that had been used by a network that in turn had transactional links to businesses that the FBI had been watching for unrelated reasons. Carol's painstaking work had provided the breadcrumb trail. Kevin's unguarded statements had provided the scaffolding for probable cause. By the end of the month, the U.S. Attorney's Office announced an investigation into possible money laundering. The local DA flagged charges of forgery and elder financial exploitation. The legal machinery began to grind in multiple tracks. Then came a disclosure that made my head swim. Agent Martinez, after consultation with her superiors and with appropriate redactions, told Harrison and I that Robert had been a cooperating source in a counter-fraud investigation for several years. He had met with agents in the past and had provided information that helped dismantle a small ring of payroll fraud. That cooperation had been quiet and mutual. It did not absolve him of everything, and the agents were careful not to create that impression. But it did mean that some of the transfers could be recontextualized. If the funds were tied to ring operations that Robert had been helping to expose, the path to declaring certain assets clear of illicit taint was possible, though never guaranteed. The practical import of this was that the complexity of Robert's financial life, as disturbing as it was, might not mean that the inheritance was legally worthless. There would be hearings, declarations, and, if necessary, forensic audits to separate what was legitimately his from what was criminally tainted. Agent Martinez warned us that this would take time and that public statements should be limited. But she also told us that, should we be successful, the assets could be used for restitution and for programs that supported victims, including, potentially, programs to protect the elderly from financial exploitation. I felt a strange wash of grief at the news. If Robert had been working with the FBI, there were layers I had not known. There were secrets he had kept and reasons he had kept them. In my head, the image of him huddled in a government office with him giving them the names and the little notebooks felt like both betrayal and a kind of bravery. The ledger I had thought I understood turned out to have columns I had never seen. As the investigation broadened, the public began to take notice. A local paper ran a cautious story about the probate freeze and the federal interest. Victoria's friends offered social media takes that were both sympathetic and thin. The town, which had sheltered our marriage for decades, misunderstood pieces and made up others. For someone who once hid her face behind curtains when company came, it was a strange exposure. But there was also a flood of support from people who had experienced similar betrayals. They sent messages, casseroles, and legal referrals. Their attention was not prying so much as communal. We knew how to hold one another up. The sting itself, the moment everyone circled like careful predators, arrived a few weeks after Kevin's arrest. The FBI had enough to secure wiretaps and to synchronize the recorded evidence with the trail Carol had mapped. They wanted Victoria and any accomplices to reveal the structure of their plan in their own words, and they wanted an unequivocal connection between the forgeries, the transfers, and the actors. The chance to obtain such statements often comes at the unguarded table where people think the conversation is private. The law allows recorded statements when properly authorized and when a party consents to talk in the presence of counsel or when a warrant covers the recording. We followed the legal roadmaps carefully. Agent Martinez asked me to be present in a limited way. She explained again that if Victoria spoke incriminally in my presence, it would strengthen the case. If she did not, we would not manufacture conversation. Harrison and I agreed on signals and safety plans. Detective Rodriguez arranged for a uniformed presence nearby if needed. Carol had compiled a binder of exhibits the agents could use if the conversation needed follow-up. The day of the sting, I sat at the kitchen table in my house while the light from the window made a stripe across the floor, dust motes floating like small witnesses. I made a pot of tea in the tin kettle Robert had once loved, and I did not drink it. Harrison sat across from me, a neat stack of papers on his lap, and Agent Martinez was in the adjacent room, headphones on, watching multiple feeds. Victoria arrived with Eleanor and another lawyer. She looked smaller than she had when she ordered me out 3 days before. She smiled the smile she had used on teachers and bank managers, a smile meant to abbreviate a messy life into legible lines. I greeted her quietly and asked if she would sit. "We just want to end this," she said in a voice that unmoored something in me. "We want to fix what got broken." "How do you propose to fix it?" I asked. Kevin was not present. He was, as the feds had arranged, in a different setting, where he had been interviewed and where he had the opportunity to speak with counsel. We did not need him in the room for the thing the agents hoped for to occur. Victoria slid into a chair and began, tentatively, to justify herself. The conversation started the way so many do, with explanations that try to cover the moral ledger. "It was never meant to be this," she said. "We were trying to protect the family. We thought we could manage the accounts so nothing lost value. We were panicked after the funeral. Money felt like continuity." Agent Martinez listened through the intercom as if she were hearing a confession through a thin wall. Harrison leaned in and asked pointed but neutral questions about who had access to which forms and why certain beneficiary changes had been requested. Victoria answered. Her language blurred between memory and narrative. At one point, she said a phrase that would later be played back in the courtroom for everyone to hear. "We thought if we moved it through a broker, nobody would notice until it was stable." That phrase was the hinge. It gave the investigators what they needed, an admission that funds had been intentionally moved in ways intended to hide their origin and to prevent quick detection. The legal team used the audio, Carol's ledger mapping, and the bank's transactional records to draft a series of warrants. The arrests were coordinated and not cinematic. No midnight explosions, no dramatic chases. Federal agents and local police executed warrants at several addresses simultaneously. Kevin remained in custody from his earlier state arrest. Federal agents took him into their custody on additional charges. Victoria was interviewed and then taken into custody on charges that included elder financial exploitation, forgery, and conspiracy. She was processed, fingerprinted, and given the chance to appear before a magistrate. Bail was set with consideration for the flight risk and the nature of the charges. The reality of bail is not the instant finality TV sometimes suggests. People are presumed innocent, and the system allows for release under conditions when appropriate. I will not pretend I watched the process without emotion. I did not revel in it. I felt a strange ambivalence, relief that the law had caught up, sorrow for the child whose mistakes had become criminal acts, and a hard knowledge that my life had been reshaped irrevocably. After the initial arrests, the federal team continued to work through the financial maze. Carroll's charts and Harrison's filings helped the prosecutors justify further steps. Agent Martinez's office began working with the bank to trace assets and determine which funds could be seized or preserved for restitution. The discovery that Robert had cooperated in prior cases complicated some questions and clarified others. The important legal distinction was this: cooperation does not automatically sanitize every transaction, but it can provide context and assist in allocating assets properly. The agents made it clear that whatever remained after legal process would be handled in accordance with law, including potential restitution to victims and legitimate distribution to heirs per the court's instructions. During the weeks that followed, I learned the mechanics of being someone whose private life became an exhibit. I sat in rooms where men and women in suits parsed spreadsheets and explained things in terms that were, to me, both alien and oddly sensible. I learned to listen for the hinge points in testimony, to watch for the small signs that indicated a story had shifted. I read reports that spoke of the possibility that some of Robert's business entanglements were messier than we had imagined, and I felt both betrayed and oddly understanding. People are complex, and marriages can be places where secrets are kept for what is imagined as protection. When Victoria was arraigned, she made the choice to plead not guilty. She had the right to that plea, and the court set a schedule for discovery and pretrial motions. Kevin's case was similarly lodged in parallel courts. I attended hearings because Harrison said it would be better if the person affected was present. I walked into court and felt like someone who had always kept her life in a neat linen drawer and was now asked to show the stains. In the months that followed, the case moved with the slow inevitability of legal systems. There were plea offers, motions to suppress certain pieces of evidence, and arguments about intent. I will not pretend the outcome was instantaneous or absolute. There were no cinematic confessions in open court. There were instead long, boring days of paperwork and negotiations, days when you learn that justice is more often a process than a moment. Throughout, I began to use whatever leverage the situation provided, not for petty revenge, but for change that mattered. If the law gave me the means to secure funds and to protect myself, I would use them for something larger than myself. With counsel and under the guidance of Agent Martinez, Harrison, and Carroll, I began to draft a plan for what I would do if the trustee determined the residuary assets should come to me under Robert's codicil, and if portions of the estate were cleared for legitimate use. I thought back to the quilt and the recipe book and the pocket watch stopped at 207, and I decided that memory needed to be honored, not sold off for a quiet life in a condo. I had seen too many older friends vanish into the thin comfort of assisted living when what they needed was advocacy and representation. I began to sketch an idea for a foundation that would help elders obtain legal counsel when they faced financial coercion. I spoke with Harrison about trust structures that could fund a nonprofit, and with Carroll about educational programs we could fund to help banks spot the signs of elder financial abuse. When, months later, the trustee concluded their review and the court ratified certain distributions in light of the codicil, the sum that came to me was indeed sizable. That sum was not a balm for everything. Money does not stitch back the nights I spent wondering why my child had chosen procurement over tenderness. But it was a tool. I used it, with counsel and under legal oversight, to establish the Sullivan Foundation for Elder Protection. We set up a legal aid fund, financed educational grants for bank compliance officers about elder abuse indicators, and created a small emergency fund for seniors who found themselves suddenly financially disabled. We did not use the funds to humiliate my daughter or to build monuments to victory. I insisted that a portion be set aside for restitution to any identified victims the prosecutors uncovered. Justice, as Harrison reminded me, should not look like a trophy. It should look like repair. 6 months after the eviction that had started it all, I returned to the house on Morton Lane with painters and a sense of deliberate labor. The porch chair had been reupholstered. The mantel had found new pictures, chosen not as replacements for old love, but as a record of survival. We laid new sheets in the guest room, and I packed the shoebox of photographs into a drawer where I could open it when I was ready. The house smelled like lemon again, but this time the lemon was not a veil, it was a choice. The kitchen held on the counter a tin of Robert's favorite cookies. I ate one and felt the texture of my life as something I was making again. The Sullivan Foundation opened with a modest gala where neighbors and colleagues arrived with casseroles and quiet support. Agent Martinez came as a guest of honor, not because she had conducted the arrests, but because the federal investigation had uncovered needs the foundation aimed to address. I spoke briefly at the podium, trying to find the balance between rage and hope. My life was almost turned into an accounting entry, I said. I want the Sullivan Foundation to be a place where others can get help before their lives are reduced to numbers on a ledger. People applauded politely, and then more earnestly when I told them how to donate and how to volunteer. We set up a hotline and partnered with local banks to create training sessions that would help financial institutions spot the signs of elder exploitation before accounts were drained. We funded a small scholarship for paralegals who wanted to specialize in elder law and provided grants to community centers that offered financial literacy for older adults. As for Victoria, we did not reconcile in any sentimental way. The law was not a family therapist, and I did not pretend it was. She remained estranged from the kind of intimacy that once existed between us. We had letters exchanged through counsel about practical matters, access points for her children to see their grandparents and supervised visits, logistical arrangements for items in the house that had sentimental value. There were moments, brief and human, where she would call and ask about a recipe or the name of a cousin, and I would answer in a manner that was kind but not intimate. Boundaries were the new language between us. There were days when old grief resurfaced like a bruise. There were nights I woke and thought I could still hear the slam of a door. But there were other days, too, when I taught a woman at the senior center how to recognize the signs of a predatory power of attorney, when a judge nodded in a hearing because evidence we had provided helped secure a protective order, when a family who had been on the verge of losing everything received small restitution from frozen funds. The house, over time, became less of a battlefield and more of a workshop. I took to my lemon cake and invited neighbors for tea. We organized workshops on estate planning because the best defense against exploitation is often a good offense. Clear documents, trusted counsel, and a thoughtful trustee. I hired Carol as a consultant for the foundation because she had a way of translating spreadsheets into stories people could understand. Harrison continued to manage our legal needs while also serving on the foundation board as counsel. Sometimes, on a soft afternoon, I would pull out the little blue recipe book Robert had given me and make lemon cake for no audience at all. I would sit on the back porch and watch the sunlight make the same chair we had once shared into a witness to survival. I would fold a linen, and in the simple ritual of it, I found a steadiness that no ledger could quantify. In the end, the story was not about money alone. It was about the way a single clause in a will, crafted with love and care by a man whose secrets I had not fully known, could become a line in the sand. It was about how a woman who had been told to find somewhere else to die instead found a reason to live with purpose. It was about the small, stubborn acts of dignity that a person can perform when given a second draft of her life, setting boundaries, demanding accountability, and using whatever power you have to protect others. Victoria's plea 3 days after she pushed me out is something I still think about. She begged then and she begged later, sometimes from a jail visiting room, sometimes on a thin phone line in the quiet of night. Begging does not erase choices. It does not absolve the pattern that led to forged signatures and midnight transfers. It does, at moments, expose the human kernel that makes punishment complicated and mercy fraught. I chose in those quiet reckonings to offer help when it was appropriate and to withhold intimacy when it would endanger me. That decision felt like honesty. I could, if I wanted, craft a public image of triumphant revenge. But justice is not my favorite flavor. Repair is, protection is. Teaching others how not to be invisible is my devotion now. If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and consider supporting elder protection organizations. The links are in the description. Share this with someone who needs to know they're not alone.